20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Part 2, Chapter 3, A Pearl of 10 Millions. Also, you can probably hear Joey purring on my lap. Night came. I went to bed, but slept badly. The sharks played an important part in my dreams. I was awakened by the steward at 4 o'clock. I got up at once and, dressing quickly, passed into the saloon. There, Captain Nemo was waiting for me. "Monsieur Aronnax," said he, "are you ready to start?" "I am." "Will you follow me, please?" "And my companions also, Captain?" "They have gone and are waiting for us." "Shall we not put on our diving dresses?" I asked. "Not yet. I have not permitted the Nautilus to come very close to the shore, and we are still at some distance from the Manar bank, but the launch is ready to take us to the exact spot and will save us a long way. It has the apparatus on board, and we can put our dresses on at the moment we commence our submarine journey." Captain Nemo then led the way towards the central staircase to the platform. There we found Ned and Conseil, delighted at the pleasure party in prospect. 5 sailors were resting on their oars in the boat alongside. Day had not yet appeared. The sky was cloudy, and but few stars were visible. I looked towards the land, but could descry nothing but a dark line across the horizon from southwest to northwest. The Nautilus, having run up the western side of Ceylon during the night, was west of the bay, or rather of the gulf formed between the main island and the island of Manar. There, beneath the dark waters, lay the bank of Pintadines, an inexhaustible pearl field 20 miles in length. Captain Nemo, Ned Land, and I took our places in the stern sheets of the launch. The coxswain took the tiller, the sailors were ready, the painter was cast off, and we started. The course was to the south. The rowers did not hurry. I noticed that, while they pulled strongly, they rested for about 10 seconds between each stroke, like man-o'-war's men. As the boat proceeded, the bubbles broke crisply upon the dark waves like drops of molten lead. A slight swell, rolling in from the offing, gave some motion to the boat and broke beneath the bows in curling waves. We were all silent. What was Captain Nemo thinking about? Perhaps of the land we were approaching, and which was too near for him, as it was still too far for the Canadian. As for Conseil, he was with us merely as a spectator. About 5:30, the first tints on the horizon showed the coastline more clearly. It appeared to be somewhat flat on the east side, but became more undulating towards the south. We were still 5 miles away, and the coast was not very distinctly seen, owing to the mist. Between us and the shore nothing was to be seen, not a diver nor his boat. A death-like silence reigned in this trysting place of pearl fishers. So, as Captain Nemo had said, we had arrived a month too soon. At 6 o'clock the day broke, with that suddenness peculiar to tropical climes. The sun's rays pierced the bank of clouds on the eastern horizon, and the orb ascended rapidly in the heavens. I could now see the land distinctly, with the trees scattered here and there upon it. The launch approached the island of Manar, which trended to the south. Captain Nemo rose from his seat and gazed over the sea. At a sign from him, the anchor was let go and the chain ran out, but not far, for the depth was not much more than a yard, and just here was the highest portion of the pearl oyster beds. The launch immediately swung to the ebb tide. "Well, here we are, Monsieur Aronnax," said the captain. "You see the bay is well enclosed. Here, in a month's time, will assemble numerous fishing boats, and in these waters the divers will go boldly to work. This bay is wonderfully formed for this kind of fishing. It is protected from the strongest winds, and the sea is never very high, which is a favourable circumstance for the divers. We will now put on our dresses and commence our excursion." I made no reply, and, all the time gazing at the suspected sea of sharks, I was assisted into my dress by one of the sailors. Captain Nemo and my companions were also inducted into their habiliments. None of the sailors of the Nautilus were to go with us. We were soon clothed up to the neck in the india rubber garments, and the air apparatus was fastened to our shoulders by braces. There was no necessity to use a Ruhmkorff lighting apparatus. Before putting on my helmet, I spoke to the captain about it. "That would be useless," he said, "as we shall not go to any great depth, and the sunlight will suffice for us. Besides, it would not be very prudent to carry an electric lamp under these waters. The light might attract some dangerous inhabitants inopportunely." As Captain Nemo spoke, I turned towards Ned and Conseil. They had already put on their helmets and could neither hear nor reply. One last question I must address to the captain. "Our arms," I said. "What about our guns?" "Guns for what?" he said. "Do not mountaineers attack bears with daggers? And is not the steel more certain than lead? Here is a true bit of steel for you. Stick it in your waist belt and let's go." I again looked at my friends. They were also furnished like ourselves, and besides the dagger, Ned Land brandished an enormous harpoon, which he had placed in the boat before we left the Nautilus. Then, following the captain's example, I put on my headpiece, and the air reservoirs immediately began to act. An instant after the sailors let us gently down into the water, and at about 10 yards from the surface, we touched a fine sand. Captain Nemo signed to us. We followed him, and descending a gentle slope, we disappeared under the waves. Once beneath the water, the fearsome ideas I had hitherto indulged disappeared, and I was quite calm. The ease with which I was able to move gave me confidence, and the unusual sights around me captivated my imagination. The sun already gave us sufficient light. The smallest objects were perceptible. After walking for 10 minutes, we were about 6 yards beneath the surface, and the sand became more level. Shoals of fish, as we advanced, rose up before us like snipe in a bog. These fish were the Monoptera genus, having no other fin than the tail. I recognized the Javanese, a true serpent, about 3 feet long, which might easily be mistaken for the conger, without the line of gold on its sides. Amongst the stromatas, whose bodies are very compressed and oval-shaped, I observed paras of brilliant colours, with scythe-like dorsal fin, an eatable fish, and which, when dried and salted, makes an excellent food called carawade. There were trank bars that belong to the apisphoroids, the bodies of which are covered with a scaly protection. Meantime, the light increased as the sun rose higher in the heavens. The nature of the ground changed by degrees. A regular causeway succeeded to the fine, firm sand, and the stones were clothed with a carpet of mollusks and zoophytes. Amid the specimens of those 2 branches, I remarked the placines, with thin and unequal shells, a sort of ostracea peculiar to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, some orange lucinae with orbicular shells, and many other interesting varieties, panopines, oculines, etc. In the midst of these living plants, and beneath the hydrophytes, lay legions of articulates, chiefly the Ranier dentulae, the carapace of which make a slightly rounded triangle. A hideous animal, and one I have encountered many times, was the enormous crab observed by Mr. Darwin, on which nature has bestowed the instinct and strength necessary to live upon coconuts. It ascends the trees on the beach, knocks off the nuts, which are cracked by the fall, and then prizes them open with its powerful claws. Here, beneath these transparent waves, this animal moves with incredible velocity. Towards 7 o'clock we reached the oyster beds, on which the pearl oysters reproduce themselves by millions. These valuable mollusks adhere to the rocks, and are there strongly attached by the byssus, which will not allow them to move. In this respect, the oyster is inferior to the lowly mussel, to which nature has granted certain powers of locomotion. Captain Nemo indicated a prodigious number of pintadines, and I could understand that the supply was really inexhaustible, for the creative power of nature is beyond man's destructive tastes. Ned Land, faithful to his instinct, hastened to fill his net with the best oysters he could gather. But we could not stay. We were obliged to follow Captain Nemo, who appeared to be striking out paths known to him alone. The ground was getting higher, evidently, and sometimes my arm, when held up, was above the surface of the water. The levels of the beds were very irregular. We often turned high rocks worn into pyramid shape. In their gloomy fissures, enormous crustacea, standing on their long limbs like war machines, looked at us with fixed eyes, while beneath our feet were many others. A large grotto now opened before us, excavated amid a picturesque mass of rock, covered with thick submarine flora. The grotto at first sight seemed very large indeed. The sun's rays seemed to be extinguished gradually, and the vague transparency might fitly be termed drowned light. Captain Nemo entered it, however. We all followed him. My eyes soon got accustomed to the gloom. I perceived that the springings of the arches were irregular and supported by natural pillars standing on broad granite bases like Tuscan columns. Why did our guide lead us into this submarine crypt? I was to know ere long. Having descended a somewhat steep decline, we reached a kind of circular pit. Here Captain Nemo stopped and pointed out to us something I had never seen before. It was an oyster of most extraordinary size, a gigantic tridacne, a shell which would have held a lake of holy water, a vase whose breadth was more than 2.5 yards, and, therefore, larger than that which was in the saloon of the Nautilus. I approached this enormous mollusk. It was fixed to a granite slab, and there it grew by itself beneath the calm waters of the grotto. I estimated its weight at 600 pounds. Now an oyster like this would contain about 30 pounds weight of meat, and one must have the stomach of a gargantua to swallow a few dozen of such natives. The captain was aware of the existence of this bivalve. Evidently it was not the first time he had visited it, and I thought that in coming hither he had only wished to show us a natural curiosity. I was mistaken. Captain Nemo had a personal interest in ascertaining the actual condition of this tridacne. The shells were open. The captain thrust his dagger between them so as to prevent them shutting again. He then raised the membranous tissue with its fringed edges which formed the covering of the oyster. There, between the plaits, I saw a loose pearl of the size of a small coconut. Its globular form, its perfect transparency, the splendid water, stamped it as a jewel of inestimable price. Actuated by an impulse of curiosity, I extended my hand to seize it and weigh it, but the captain stopped me, shook his head, and, withdrawing his dagger, permitted the shells to close suddenly. I then understood his motives. By leaving this pearl hidden within the tridacne, he allowed it to grow insensibly. With each year of existence, the mollusk added new concentric rings. The captain alone was acquainted with this grotto in which this admirable fruit of nature was ripening. He alone would reap it, so to speak, for his famous museum. Perhaps, after the fashion of the Chinese and Indians, he had brought the pearl into existence by introducing into the folds of the mollusk a piece of glass or iron, which became covered by the nacreous substance by degrees. In any case, comparing this pearl to those which I already knew, and to those which glittered amid the captain's collection, I should say that its value was 10 millions of francs at least. It was a magnificent natural curiosity, and not a jewel, for there are no ladies' ears capable of sustaining such a weight. Our visit to this aristocrat's tridacne was over. Captain Nemo left the grotto, and we remounted to the oyster beds into those clear waters not yet disturbed by divers. We walked singly, in an easy sort of way, stopping or advancing as suited our respective fancies. For my part, I had no thought for the dangers I had previously conjured up. We were advancing sensibly towards the surface, and my head soon rose high above it as I stood in less than 4 feet of water. Conseil drew near me, and, putting his helmeted head close to mine, made eyes at me in the most friendly manner. But this high ground did not extend for any great distance, and we soon were below the surface of our element. I believe I am entitled to say so now. 10 minutes after, Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. I fancied he had only halted in order to retrace his steps. No. By a gesture, he directed us to crouch near him, at the bottom of a large fissure. He pointed towards a particular spot. I looked steadily at it. About 6 yards off, a shadow appeared and fell on the ground. The nervous idea of sharks crossed my mind, but I was wrong, and this time we had not to encounter these ocean monsters. It was a man. A living man. An Indian. A poor devil of a diver, no doubt, who came to glean before the corn was cut. I could perceive his canoe anchored some feet above his head. He dived and ascended again. A stone, which he held between his feet, a cord that secured him to the boat, was sufficient to cause him to descend rapidly. This was his whole apparatus. As he reached the bottom, he fell upon his knees and filled his net with pintadines, collected indiscriminately. He then ascended, emptied the net, replaced the stone, and recommenced his operations, which never exceeded 30 seconds' duration. The diver did not perceive us. The shadow of the rock hid us, and, besides, how could this poor Indian suppose that beings like himself would be there under water watching his movements, not losing a detail? Many times he ascended and dived again. He did not bring up more than 10 oysters at a time, for he was obliged to tear some away by main force. And how many of these oysters had no pearls, for which he was risking his life? I was watching him with fixed attention. His movements were regular, and during half an hour no danger threatened him. I was getting accustomed in watching this interesting fishing, when, suddenly, as the Indian was kneeling on the ground, I saw him make a gesture of terror, rise up, and spring for his boat. I understood the position. A gigantic shadow appeared above the terrified diver. It was a shark of the largest size, which was swimming diagonally, eyes flaming, and with extended jaws. I was petrified with horror. The voracious fish, by a vigorous stroke of his fins, darted towards the Indian, who threw himself aside and avoided the open jaws of the shark, but not the stroke of his tail, for he received a blow in the chest which stretched him on the ground. This was the work of a few seconds. The shark came again to the attack and, turning on his back, seemed about to cut the Indian in two, when Captain Nemo jumped up, poniard in hand, and rushed straight at the monster, ready for a hand-to-hand encounter. The shark perceived this new adversary just as he was about to snap up the unfortunate diver, and, turning on his belly, he went for the captain. I can still see Captain Nemo as he stood. With wonderful self-possession, he coolly waited the attack of this enormous shark, and, when it rushed at him, the captain, jumping aside with surprising dexterity, avoided the contact and plunged his dagger into the belly of the animal. But all was not over. A terrible fight ensued. The shark seemed to roar, as it were. The blood poured in torrents from the wounds. The sea was tinged with red, and through this opaque liquid I could not perceive how the fight was waging. I saw nothing more until the moment when, as the ensanguined waves cleared away, I perceived the undaunted captain holding to one of the shark's fins and dealing him blow after blow, but unable to deal a mortal one at the heart. The shark, in its struggles, so agitated the water that I could scarcely keep my position. I wished to get to the captain's assistance, but I was nailed by horror to the spot. I looked on with haggard eye. I saw the varying fortunes of the combat. The captain fell upon the ground, overturned by the enormous mass that weighed upon him. Then the shark's jaws opened like enormous shears. and would have made an end of the captain had not Ned Land, quick as thought, precipitated himself, harpoon in hand, upon the shark and driven the terrible weapon into his side. The waves were immediately a mass of blood and rolled in large billows as the shark beat them in his struggles. Ned Land had struck home. This was the monster's last gasp. Pierced to the heart, he beat out his life in spasmodic writhings, the shock of which upset Conseil. Meantime, Ned Land had gone to the captain's assistance, and he, again on his feet, hastened to the Indian, cut the cord which fastened the stone, and, taking him in his arms, by a vigorous stroke, ascended to the surface. We all followed, and in a few minutes, most miraculously preserved from death, we reached the diver's boat. Captain Nemo's first care was to restore this unfortunate man to life. I was afraid he would not succeed. I hoped he would, for the poor man's immersion had not lasted long, but the blow from the shark's tail might have been fatal. Happily, by vigorous rubbing, I perceived the diver regaining consciousness. He opened his eyes, and great was his astonishment to perceive 4 great copper-helmeted heads leaning over him. And still greater must have been his surprise when Captain Nemo, taking a string of pearls from his dress, placed them in his hand. This munificent present from the man of the seas to the poor Cingalese was accepted with trembling hands. His startled eyes showed that he did not know what superhuman beings he owed at once his fortune and his life. At a sign from the captain we regained the oyster beds, and, retracing our steps, we reached the anchor of the launch in about half an hour. Once again, on board, we, with the sailor's assistance, took off our dresses. Captain Nemo's first words were addressed to the Canadian. "Thank you, Master Land," he said. "It was only a return match," said Ned. "I owed you that." A wan smile flitted across the captain's features, and that was all. "To the Nautilus!" he cried. The boat flew over the waves. Some minutes later we encountered the dead body of the shark floating on the surface. In its black marking at the extremities of the fins, I recognized the terrible Melanopteron of the Indian seas, sharks properly so called. Its length was 25 feet. Its enormous mouth occupied a third of its body. It was a full-grown specimen, as we could perceive by the 6 rows of teeth, disposed in the form of an isosceles triangle in its upper jaw. Conseil regarded it from an entirely scientific point of view, and I am sure he classed it, and not without reason, amongst the cartilaginous animals, order of chondropterygians with fixed gills, family Silation, genus sharks. While I was looking at it, a dozen of its voracious relatives appeared close by, but, without noticing us, they threw themselves upon the corpse and fought for the fragments. At 9:30 we were on board the Nautilus again. There I began to reflect upon the incidents of our excursion to the Manar bank. 2 reflections suggested themselves at once. One was the unparalleled bravery of Captain Nemo. The other, his devotion to a human being, a representative of the race he shunned. Whatever he might hint to the contrary, I was persuaded that this extraordinary man was not entirely devoid of heart. When I said as much to him, he replied with some little emotion, "That Indian, monsieur, is an inhabitant of an oppressed country. I am, and shall be to my last day, such a one myself." Chapter 4. The Red Sea. During the day, the island of Ceylon disappeared from view, and the Nautilus steamed at about 20 miles an hour into the labyrinth of canals that separate the Maldives from the Laccadive Isles. We skirted the island of Kitlan, the madreporic formation, which was discovered by Vasco da Gama in 1499, and is one of the 19 large islands of the Laccadive group, situated between 10 degrees and 14 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, and 69 degrees and 50 degrees 72 minutes east longitude. We had now made 16,220 miles, or 7,500 leagues, since our departure from Japan. Next day, 30th of January, when the Nautilus rose to the surface, no land was in sight. We steered north-northwest towards the Sea of Oman, between Arabia and Hindustan, which is the mouth of the Persian Gulf. There was evidently no egress. Whither was Captain Nemo leading us? I could not say. This did not satisfy Ned, who asked me where we were going. "We are going," said I, "whither the captain's fancy leads us." "This fancy will not lead us very far, then. There is no other outlet to the Persian Gulf, and if we enter it we shall soon have to retrace our steps." "Well, then we must come back again, Master Land, and if after the Persian Gulf the Nautilus chooses to visit the Red Sea, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb is always free to us." "I need scarcely tell you, sir," replied Ned Land, "that the Red Sea is closed equally with the Gulf, since the Isthmus of Suez is not yet cut through, and if it were, a mysterious vessel like ours would not risk herself in a canal intersected with sluices. So the Red Sea is not our road to Europe." "But I have not said that we were going back to Europe." "What do you think, then?" "I suppose that, after having seen the curious localities of Arabia and Egypt, the Nautilus will go back into the Indian Ocean again, perhaps through the Mozambique Channel, perhaps outside Madagascar, so as to gain the Cape of Good Hope." "And when we have reached the Cape?" asked the Canadian, with peculiar insistence. "Well, then we shall explore that part of the Atlantic we do not yet know." "Friend Ned, you are getting tired of this submarine travelling. You are blasé with the incessant wonders of the sea, varied though they be. For my own part, I shall be sorry to come to the end of a voyage such as is given to few men to enjoy." "But are you aware that we have been shut up in the Nautilus nearly 3 months?" "No, Ned, I did not know it. I do not wish to, and I reckon neither hours nor days." "But what is the end to be?" "The end will come in good times. Besides, we can do nothing, and there is no use talking about it. If you should come to me and say, 'I see a chance for escape for us,' I would go into the question with you. But that is not the case now, and I tell you frankly I do not think that Captain Nemo will ever venture into European waters." By this short conversation you will perceive that I was almost as much attached to the Nautilus as its commander. Ned Land brought the interview to a conclusion by the following muttered words: "That is all very well, but in my opinion, when one is tired of the thing, there is no fun in it." For 4 days the Nautilus explored the Sea of Oman at various depths and with varying speed. We appeared to be sailing at random, as if there were some hesitation respecting our route, but we did not pass the Tropic of Cancer. As we left this sea, we caught a glimpse of Muscat, the most important town of the Oman territory. I admired its strange aspect in the midst of the black roots surrounding it, and against which the white houses and forts stood out in strong relief. The round domes of the mosques, the tapering points of the minarets, the fresh green terraces were all before us, but it was only a fleeting vision, for the Nautilus again plunged under Oman's green water. We afterwards coasted the Arabian shore for 6 miles, and its line of undulating mountains dotted with ancient ruins. On the 5th of February we entered the Gulf of Aden, a regular funnel introduced into the neck of Bab el-Mandeb, which serves the entrance for the waters of the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea. Next day the Nautilus lay off Aden, which is perched up upon a promontory united to the mainland by a narrow isthmus, a miniature Gibraltar, the fortifications having been built by the English in 1839. I could see the octagon minarets of the town, which was formerly one of the richest commercial stations on the coast. I was certain that Captain Nemo would now retrace his steps, but to my surprise he did nothing of the kind. On the 7th we entered Bab el-Mandeb, which the Arabic signifies Gate of Tears. The strait is 20 miles wide and about 30 long, and for the Nautilus at full speed, the passage was accomplished in less than an hour. But I saw nothing, not even the island of Perim, by which the British government has strengthened the position of Aden. Too many steamers of all nations passed this strait for the Nautilus to venture to show herself, so we prudently kept under water. At noon we were in the Red Sea. This sea, celebrated in Bible history, is scarcely refreshed by rain, nor is it supplied by any important river. It is subject to an excessive evaporation, and loses each year a layer of water about 2 yards high. A singular gulf, which, enclosed and under similar conditions to a lake, would be dried up, and in this respect inferior to its neighbours the Caspian or the Dead Sea, the levels of which have only descended to the point where their evaporation exactly equals the amount of water received by them. The Red Sea is about 1,500 and 1,600 miles long, and about 150 miles in width. At the time of the Ptolemies and the Roman Empire, it was the great commercial artery of the world, and the cutting of the Suez Canal will restore it to its former importance, a result that the railway has already partly brought about. I did not even seek to understand the caprice of the captain, which had decided him to enter the Red Sea, but I quite approved this course. He went at less speed, sometimes at the surface, sometimes plunging down to escape observation, and I was able to notice both the upper and lower parts of this curious sea. On the 8th of February, at dawn, we sighted Mocha, a town now ruined, whose walls would fall down at the report of a single cannon. It was formerly an important city, enclosing 6 public markets, 26 mosques, and the walls, defended by 14 fortresses, were more than 2 miles in circumference. The Nautilus approached close to the African side, where the depth of water is greater. There, in a medium as clear as crystal, we were able to gaze upon the beautiful corals and the enormous masses of rock covered with algae and fuci. It was indescribable. What a variety of landscapes there were among those rocks and islands which border on the Libyan coasts. But it was on the eastern side that these appeared in full beauty, and the Nautilus was not long in reaching them. This was on the Tehama coast, for there not only did the expanse of the zoophytes flourish below the level of the sea, but they entwined themselves picturesquely some feet above the surface. These were more extensive, but less beautiful than those which were kept fresher by the surrounding vitality of the waters. How many pleasant hours I passed at the open panels of the saloon! What numbers of specimens of submarine flora I admired by the gleam of the electric light! Mushroom-shaped fungi, red-coloured sea anemones amongst others, the Thalassanthus aster, tubipores like flutes, which only waited the breath of the great god Pan. Shells peculiar to this sea, which were resting in the holes made by the madrepores, and the bases of which were turned in short spiral. And finally, what I had never seen in its natural polyp state, the common sponge. The class of sponges, first in the group of polypi, has been precisely created by this curious product, the uses of which are indisputable. The sponge is not a vegetable, as some naturalists think it, but an animal of the lowest order, a polyp inferior to the coral. There is no doubt of it being an animal, and one cannot even adopt the classification of the ancients, who put it between the plants and animals. I ought to mention that the naturalists do not agree respecting the mode of organization of the sponge. Some say it is a polypus, others, such as Mr. Milne Edwards, that it is an isolated species and unique. The class of sponges include about 300 species which are met with in many seas, and even in watercourses where they received the name fluviatiles. But they are chiefly found in the Mediterranean, in the Grecian archipelago, on the coasts of Syria, and in the Red Sea. There the softest and most beautiful sponges grow, and rise to a value of £6 sterling, such as the white Syrian sponge, Barbary sponge, etc. but as I could not hope to study the zoophytes in the Levant, from which we were separated by the Isthmus of Suez, I was obliged to content myself by examining them in the Red Sea. I called Conseil to me while the Nautilus slowly passed by the beautiful rocks of the eastern coast at about 10 yards below the surface. Sponges of all shapes and sizes were there, pediculated, foliated, globulous and digital. They justified the appellations of baskets, vases, distaffs, elk horns, lion's feet, peacock tail, Neptune's glove, which have been bestowed upon them by the fishermen more poetical than naturalists. From the fibrous tissue coated with a semi-gelatinous substance, a thread of water is incessantly escaping, which, having carried life into each cell, is expelled by a contractile movement. This substance disappears after the death of the polypus, which, when putrefying, disengages ammonia. Nothing is then left but the horny gelatinous fibres, forming the domestic sponge, which takes a russet tinge, and is used in various ways according to its elasticity, permeability, or resistance to maceration. These polyps adhere to rocks, to shells of mollusks, and even to the stalks of hydrophytes. They garnish the smallest crevices, some extending outwards, others close or hanging down like corals. I told Conseil that these sponges are fished for in two ways, by a drag or by hand. The latter method is preferable, for the divers take care of the tissue of the polyp, and this gives the commodity greater value. The other zoophytes which live near the sponges are chiefly medusae of beautiful species. Mollusks were represented by the varieties of calmar, which, according to Aubigny, are peculiar to the Red Sea, and the reptiles of the Vergata turtle, belonging to the Coloniae genus, which furnishes our table with such delicate and wholesome food. The fish were numerous, and often remarkable. The nets of the Nautilus were frequently drawn, and we found rays of a reddish brick colour, mullet, gobies, blennies, ballista, hammerfish, and 1,000 other fish common to the oceans which we had already traversed. On the 9th of February, the Nautilus was in the broadest part of the Red Sea, which is between Suakin on the west and Confoda on the east coast, a distance of 90 miles. At noon, Captain Nemo came upon the platform where he found me. I determined not to allow him to go away without having at least given me some hint as to his future proceedings. He approached me as soon as he saw me, and offered me a cigar. "Well, monsieur," he said, "does the Red Sea please you? Have you sufficiently examined the wonders it contains, its fish and zoophytes, its sponges and corals? Have you seen the towns on the coast?" "Yes, Captain Nemo," I replied, "and the Nautilus is wonderfully fitted for such studies. It is a very cleverly designed vessel." "Yes, sir, clever, fearless, and invulnerable. It neither fears the tempests of the Red Sea, its currents, nor its rocks." "In fact," said I, "this sea is quoted as being one of the worst, and, if I do not mistake, its reputation in ancient times was very bad indeed." "Detestable, Monsieur Aronnax. The Greek and Latin writers do not speak well of it, and Strabo says that it is particularly dangerous during the season of the Etesian winds, and in the rainy season. The Arab historian Idrisi, who has described it under the name of the Gulf of Kulzum, relates that ships have perished in great numbers on its sandbanks, and that no one would venture to navigate it during the night. It was, he states, subject to terrific hurricanes, and interspersed with barren islands, and had nothing good in it, either above or below. Such indeed was the opinion of Arrian, Agatharchides, and Artemidorus. One can very easily perceive that these historians never navigated it in the Nautilus," said I. "Exactly," replied the captain, smiling, "and in this respect the moderns are not much more advanced than were the ancients. It has taken many centuries to develop the mechanical powers of steam. Who knows but that in 100 years they may see another Nautilus? Progress is slow, Monsieur Aronnax." "It is true," said I, "that your vessel is a century many centuries perhaps, in advance of its time. What a pity it is that a secret should die with its inventor." Captain Nemo made no answer. After a pause, he said, "We were speaking of the opinions of ancient historians respecting the dangers of the Red Sea." "Yes," I said, "but were not their fears exaggerated?" "Well, yes, and no, Monsieur Aronnax," replied the captain, who seemed to have physically and morally gone deeply into the Red Sea. "That which is not dangerous for a modern ship, well found and solidly built, and, thanks to steam power, master of its course, would offer considerable danger to ancient galleys. We must consider these first navigators in their roughly built vessels. They had not any instruments to take bearings, and they sailed at the mercy of almost unknown currents. Under such conditions, shipwrecks were, as might be expected, frequent. But in our time, the steamers that perform the service between Suez and the southern seas have nothing to fear in this sea, despite of monsoons even. Captains and passengers do not offer propitiatory sacrifices before starting, and when they return, they do not carry gilded ornaments and fillets of thank offerings to the gods." "I agree with you," I said, "and steam appears to have killed thankfulness in the hearts of sailors. But, Captain, as you appear to have made this sea your study, can you tell me the origin of its name?" "Numerous explanations exist. Should you like to know the opinion of a chronicler of the 14th century?" "Very much indeed." "This writer pretends that the name was bestowed upon it after the passage of the Israelites, when Pharaoh perished at the closing of the waters. As sign of miracle so dread, the waves became a rosy red, and since by ages handed down, as the Red Sea the Gulf is known." This does also have this in the original French, which I guess I'm going to take a crack at. "On signe de cette merveille, devine la mer rouge et vermeille, non puis ne sont la nommer autrement que la rouge mer." "A poetical explanation, Captain," I replied, "but I cannot accept that reason. I should like your own opinion." "You shall have it. In my opinion, Monsieur Aronnax, the name Red Sea is a translation from the Hebrew word Edrom, and if the ancients give it that name, it was in consequence of the peculiar colouring of its water. Till now, nevertheless, I have observed nothing but clear water without any peculiar tint whatsoever." "No doubt, but towards the end of this gulf you will perceive this singular appearance. I remember having seen it in the Bay of Tor, perfectly red, like a lake of blood." "And this colour you attribute to the presence of microscopic algae?" "Yes. It is a purple mucilaginous seaweed produced by the plants known as Trichodesmia, and of which it requires 40,000 to occupy a space of a surface of about 0.04 of an inch square. Perhaps at Tor we may meet them." "I perceive, Captain, that this is not the first time you have traversed the Red Sea." "No." "Well, as you were speaking just now of the passage of the Israelites and the destruction of the Egyptians, I would ask if any submarine traces of this fact have been discovered." "No, monsieur, and for a very excellent reason." "What is that?" "Because the spot where Moses crossed over with his people is now so silted up that camels can scarcely bathe their limbs there. Even my Nautilus could not float in that spot." "And where is the place?" "It is situated a little below the Isthmus of Suez, in the arm that formerly formed a deep estuary at the time when the Red Sea extended to the Salt Lakes. Now, whether this passage was miraculous or not, the Israelites did not the less pass there to gain the promised land, and the army of Pharaoh perished at the identical spot. I think, therefore, that excavations into these sands would be successful in discovering a quantity of ancient Egyptian arms and accoutrements." "No doubt," I replied, "and it is to be hoped for archaeologists that these excavations will be made in the town when towns shall be built upon the isthmus after the construction of the Suez Canal. A very useless canal for such a ship as the Nautilus." "I dare say, but very useful to the world in general," replied Captain Nemo. The ancients understood the utility of establishing a water communication between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, but they did not think of cutting a canal direct, and they took the Nile as the intermediary route. Very probably, the canal which united the Nile to the Red Sea was commenced under Sesostris, if tradition may be accepted. It is certain, however, that in 615 BC, Nekos undertook the excavation of an alimentary canal across the plain of Egypt opposite Arabia. And 1 second, I just have to allow a cat to leave the room. I return. There is still one cat in the room, who probably wishes to leave soon. This canal might be ascended in 4 days, and its width was that of 2 triremes abreast. It was continued by Darius, the son of Hydaspes, and probably completed by Ptolemy II. Strabo saw it in use for vessels, but the very slight fall between its point of departure near Bubastes to the Red Sea rendered it navigable only for a few months of the year. This canal served for commerce up to the age of Antonius, when it was abandoned, then silted up, but restored by the Caliph Omar. It was finally filled in 761 or 762 by the Caliph Al-Mansur, who wished to prevent food from reaching Muhammad ben Abdullah, who had revolted against him. During Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, the traces of the work were discovered in the desert of Suez, and, surprised by the tide, the French were nearly lost some distance from Hajaroth, the same place where Moses had encamped 3,000 years before. Well, Captain, if the ancients failed to make this canal, which would shorten the distance from Cadiz to India by water by nearly 6,000 miles, Monsieur de Lesseps has done it, and before long he will have changed Africa into an immense island. Yes, Monsieur Aronnax, and you have reason to be proud of your countryman. He is a greater hero to a nation than a great general. He began, like many others, under slights and rebuffs, but he has triumphed, for he has brain and good will. It is sad to think that this undertaking, which ought to have been international and is sufficient to add lustre to any region, was only successful owing to the energy of one man. So all honour to Monsieur de Lesseps. Yes, all honour to this great citizen, I reply, surprised by the manner in which Captain Nemo spoke. Unfortunately, he said, I cannot take you up the Suez Canal, but the day after tomorrow you will see the long piers of Port Said, when we shall be in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean? I exclaimed. Yes. Does that astonish you? Yes, it does. The idea that we shall be there the day after tomorrow. Really? Yes, Captain, although I confess I ought not to be surprised at anything while on board your vessel. But why are you surprised? Because I think of the awful speed you must make to double the Cape of Good Hope, go round Africa, and enter the Mediterranean the day after tomorrow. And who told you that I am going to double the Cape and go up the African coast, eh? Well, you will admit that even the Nautilus cannot sail on dry land across the Isthmus of Suez. Nor beneath it, Monsieur Aronnax? Beneath it? I echoed. Certainly, replied the captain calmly. Nature long ago made underneath what mortals have only today completed on the surface. What do you say? A passage exists? Yes, a subterranean passage does exist. I call it the Arabian Tunnel. It commences underneath Suez and ends in the Gulf of Pelusium. But the isthmus is only composed of shifting sand. To a certain depth, yes, but at about 60 yards down there is solid rock. And did you discover this passage by chance? By chance and reason, Professor, and by reason even more than chance. Captain Nemo, I hear you, but my ears can scarcely take it all in. Excuse me, there was a cable stuck under my foot. There we go. Ah, monsieur, aures habent et non audient is a motto for all ages. Not only does this passage exist, but I have often taken advantage of it. Were it not for it, I should not have come into the Red Sea at all just now. May I ask how you discovered the tunnel? Monsieur, replied the captain, there is no reason to keep any secret between people who will never be separated. I did not notice the insinuation and waited for the captain's explanation. Monsieur Aronnax, said he, it was the simple reasoning of a naturalist that led me to the discovery of this passage, with which I alone am acquainted. I had remarked that in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean there existed a number of fish identical in every respect. Once certain of this fact, I began to consider whether there might not be some communication between the two seas. If such existed, the subterranean current would flow from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean by the simple difference of level. I then caught a quantity of fish off Suez. I placed on their tails brass rings and let them go. Some months later, on the Syrian coasts, I pulled up some specimens of fish which were decorated with brass rings on their tails. Thus the communication between the seas was demonstrated. I made search with the Nautilus. I discovered the passage. I ventured into it, and before long, sir, you will also have passed the Arabian Tunnel. And that is where I shall take my first break. Or the only break. Thank you. Go do what you need to do. Get up, stretch, rotate your fluids and such, and I will see you back here in 5 minutes. Thank you. Well, hello and welcome back. I trust and hope that you have had a good break. I apologise that I'm not live at the point of reading this for any sort of interaction with comments and things, but yeah, I'm ready to continue. I hope you've done what was needed and are back here in time. I'll give you a little bit of stalling just to let people return if needed, if you're still away. You'll be pleased to know Joey has resumed his place upon my lap. He is back and will probably interrupt things at some point, but is frankly at the moment providing a decent function as a sort of pseudo hot water bottle. A mobile and independent hot water bottle, but one that provides warmth nonetheless. But yeah, I've skimmed ahead what's coming up, and I hope you like more tales of just people charting the seas, discovering wonderful things, and then eating them. Because that's what we've got. So yeah, without any more preamble, I guess I might as well carry on with things. So this is Chapter 5, The Arabian Tunnel. That day, I reported to Conseil and Ned Land such portions of my conversation with Captain Nemo as directly interested them. When I told them that in 2 days we should be in the Mediterranean, Conseil clapped his hands, but the Canadian shrugged his shoulders. "A submarine tunnel?" he cried. "A communication between the seas? Who ever heard of such a thing?" "Friend Ned," replied Conseil, "had you ever heard of the Nautilus?" "No, but it nevertheless is a fact. Therefore, do not shrug your shoulders so quickly, and do not disbelieve things because you have never heard of them." "We shall see," said Ned, nodding his head. "After all, I desire nothing better than to make this passage into the Mediterranean." The same evening, in 21 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, the Nautilus approached the Arabian coast. I could see Jeddah, an important exchange of Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and the Indies. I could distinguish clearly its houses, the vessels alongside the quays, and those anchored farther out. The setting sun fell full upon the houses, making them appear so very white, while farther off some cabins or woods of woods or reeds indicated the Bedouin quarter. Jeddah was soon lost in the gloom, and the Nautilus descended beneath the phosphorescent water. Next day, February 10th, many vessels appeared to windward. The Nautilus resumed her submarine navigation, but at midday, at the time for taking bearings, the sea was clear of ships as we came to the surface again. Accompanied by Ned and Conseil, I sat down upon the platform. The coast of the east side was half hidden by a thick mist. Sorry, Joey has just rested his chin on my arm. It's adorable, and I wish you could all see. Leaning against the launch, we were chatting on various topics when Ned, extending his hand, said, "Do you see anything over there, sir?" "No, Ned," I replied. "My eyes are not so good as yours." "Look steadily," replied Ned, "a little above the lanthorn to starboard. Don't you see something moving?" "In fact," I said, after gazing attentively in the direction indicated, "I do believe there is a long black body at the surface of the water." "Another Nautilus?" suggested Conseil. "No," said the Canadian. "If I mistake not, it's some marine animal." "Are there any whales in the Red Sea?" asked Conseil. "Yes," I replied. They are sometimes met with." "It's not a whale," said Ned, who still kept his gaze fixed upon the object. "Whales and I are such old acquaintances that I cannot mistake them." "Let us wait," said Conseil. "The Nautilus is going in that direction. We shall soon see what it is." The black object was soon within a mile of us. It looked like a great sandbank. What could it be? I was not able to decide. "Aha! It moves! It dives!" cried Ned. "Thousand devils! What can it be? Its tail is not divided like the whales and cachalots, and its fins look as if they had been cut. But then—" "Look there!" cried the Canadian. "It is on its back!" "It is a siren, a true siren!" cried Conseil, "if Monsieur has no objection." The term siren gave me a hint, and I perceived at once that this animal belonged to that order of marine animals which are fabulously called sirens, half female, half fish. "No," I said to Conseil, "it is not a siren, but a very curious being of which very few specimens exist in the Red Sea. It is a dugong." Order, sirens, group, Pisciform, subclass, monodolphin, class, mammifer, branch, vertebrates, replied Conseil. When Conseil had said this, there was nothing to add. Meanwhile, Ned kept his eyes fixed on the dugong, and they shone with expectation. His hand seemed ready to grasp his harpoon, and one would have said that he only awaited the proper moment to throw himself into the sea and attack the animal in his native element. "Oh, monsieur," he said in a voice trembling with eagerness, "I have never killed one of that kind." All the harpooner was in these words. Just then the captain appeared. He noticed the dugong. Understanding the attitude of the Canadian, he at once addressed him. "If you had a harpoon in your hands just now, Master Land, it would burn your palm, would it not?" "Quite true, sir." "And it would not displease you to return to your former avocation for a day, and to add yonder cetacean to the list of your victories?" "It would not displease me in the least." "Well then, you can try." "Thank you, sir," replied Ned Land, with kindling eyes. "Only, I advise you not to miss that creature, for your own sake." "Is the dugong a very dangerous animal to attack?" I asked, notwithstanding Ned's shrug of the shoulders. "Sometimes," replied Captain Nemo, "the animal will turn and attack its assailant. But with Master Land this danger is not to be apprehended. His eye is quick, his arm sure. If I recommend him not to miss his stroke, it was because I look at it as fine game, and I know Master Land has no objection to tidbits." "Ah!" cried Ned, "so he is good to eat, is he?" "Yes, his flesh is held in high estimation, and the Malays universally reserve it for the tables of their princes. Indeed, they hunt the animal so persistently that, like its relation the manatee, it has become very scarce." "Then, monsieur," said Conseil to the captain, "if that dugong be the last of his race, would it not be better to spare him in the interest of science?" "Perhaps so," replied Ned, "but in the interest of cookery, it would be better to give him chase." "Well, go ahead, Master Land," cried the captain. Now 7 of the crew, silent as ever, appeared upon the platform. One of them carried a harpoon and line similar to those used in whaling. The boat was lowered. 6 rowers took their places, and the coxswain seized the tiller. Ned, Conseil, and myself sat in the stern sheets. "Are you not coming, Captain?" "No, Professor, but I wish you good sport." The boat shoved off, and, impelled by 6 sturdy rowers, rapidly approached the dugong. We slacked speed a few cables' length from the creature, and pulled silently. Ned Land, harpoon in hand, took up his position in the bows. The usual whaling harpoon is attached to a long cord, which is paid out when the animal dives, but in this instance there were only about 12 fathoms of line, and at the end of this a barrel was fastened so as to indicate the course of the dugong in the water. I got up and took a good look at the enemy. The dugong, also known as the halicore, is very much like the manatee or lamantine. Its body is terminated by a long tail and its lateral fins by fingers. The difference between the dugong and manatee consists in the former being armed with 2 long and pointed teeth in its upper jaw, which form a defence for each side. This was the animal that Ned was about to attack. Its length was about 24 feet. It did not move, and appeared to be sleeping, which circumstance would render its capture more easily. The launch approached cautiously to within 3 fathoms. The oars were eased. I half raised myself. Ned Land, his body thrown back a little, brandished his harpoon. Suddenly a hissing noise was heard, and the dugong disappeared. The harpoon forcibly cast had only struck the water apparently. "Thousand devils!" cried Ned furiously. "I've missed it!" "No," I said, "the animal is wounded. Look at the blood." But the weapon did not stick in the body. "My harpoon! My harpoon!" cried Ned. The sailors pulled, and the coxswain steered for the barrel. The harpoon was picked up, and the chase recommenced. The dugong came up to the surface to breathe occasionally, The wound had not disabled him, for he swam with great rapidity. The boat, impelled by vigorous arms, flew upon his track. Many times we were close to him, and the Canadian was prepared to strike, but the dugong plunged suddenly, and it was impossible to reach it. You may imagine Ned Land's indignation. He heaped the most energetic forms of expression upon the unhappy animal. For my part, I was annoyed to see the dugong escape us. We pursued it steadily for an hour, and I was beginning to believe that its capture would be a very difficult operation, when the animal was suddenly seized with the idea of retaliation, of which we had cause to repent later, and came to attack the boat. This manoeuvre did not escape the Canadian. "Look out, men!" he cried. The coxswain addressed his crew in his peculiar tongue, and no doubt put them on the guard. Arrived at 20 feet from the boat, the dugong pulled up. He sniffed the air with his immense nostrils, pierced in the upper part of the muzzle. Then, with a sprang, he threw himself upon us. The boat could not avoid the shock. It was nearly upset, and took in a couple of tons of water, which it was necessary to get rid of. But, thanks to the coxswain, we received the blow sideways, and we were not upset. Ned Land, holding on tightly to the bows, struck blow after blow at the gigantic animal, which, having fastened its teeth in the gunwale, nearly lifted the boat out of the water. We were thrown all together in a heap, and I do not know how the adventure would have terminated had not the Canadian sent a lucky blow direct to the creature's heart. I heard its teeth grinding upon the gunwale, and the animal disappeared, taking the harpoon with him. But the barrel soon came to the surface again, and a few minutes afterwards the body of the dugong appeared floating on its back. We pulled towards it, took it in tow, and returned to the Nautilus. It was necessary to employ some very strong tackle to hoist the dugong on board. It weighed more than 4 tons. It was cut up under the superintendence of the Canadian, and the same afternoon the steward served me with slices of the excellent flesh. I found it very good, superior to veal, if not to beef. Next day our larder was again enriched by some choice game. A flock of sea swallows alighted on the Nautilus. They were a species of Sterna milotica, peculiar to Egypt. The beak is white, the head grey and pointed. The eyes are surrounded by white spots. The back, wings and tail are greyish. The belly and throat white. The feet are red. We also captured some dozen Nile ducks, wild birds of a high flavour. The speed was then lowered. We strolled along, so to speak. I noticed that the water of the Red Sea became less and less salt as we approached the Suez. About 5 p.m. we sighted the Cape of Ras Mohammed. This cape forms the extremity of Arabia Petraea, which is included between the Gulfs of Suez and Aqaba. The Nautilus entered the Jubal Straits, which leads to the Gulf of Suez. I could distinctly see a high mountain rising up between the two gulfs. It was Mount Horeb, at the summit of which Moses met God face to face in the midst of the fiery bush. At 6 o'clock the Nautilus passed Tor at some distance. At the end of the bay the waters appeared red, as Captain Nemo had stated. Night fell, and the deep silence was sometimes broken by the cry of the pelican or some night birds, and by the noise of the waves, or the distant beat of the paddles of a steamer. From 8 to 9 o'clock the Nautilus remained some yards below the surface. As far as I could judge, we were very close to Suez. Through the windows of the saloon I could perceive the adjacent rocks lighted up by our electric gleam. The straits seemed to be getting narrower and narrower. At 9:15 we rose to the surface. I went upon the platform. I was very impatient to go through Captain Nemo's tunnel. I could not keep quiet, and I sought the fresh air. Very soon I perceived a pale light breaking through the gloom, and half discoloured by the surrounding fog. It appeared to be shining about a mile off. "A floating lighthouse," said someone close to me. I turned round and recognised the captain. "It is the Suez floating light," he said. "We shall not be long ere we reach the entrance to the tunnel." The entrance is not very easy, I suppose? No, and therefore I am in the habit of taking the helm myself as we go through. Now, Monsieur Aronnax, if you will be so good as to go below, the Nautilus will do the same, and not return to the surface until she has cleared the Arabian Tunnel. I followed the captain. The panels were closed, the reservoirs of water filled, and the vessel descended for a distance of 40 feet or so. Just as I was about to enter my room, Captain Nemo stopped me. "Would you like to come with me to the pilot house?" he asked. "I scarcely dared to ask you," I said. "Come along. You will see all that can be seen at once beneath the earth and under water." Captain Nemo led the way to the central staircase. Halfway up, he opened a door and reached the pilot cage, which was, as may be remembered, at the extremity of the platform. It was a cabin measuring about 6 feet square, and somewhat like those occupied by pilots in the Mississippi and Hudson steamers. A wheel, vertically placed, occupied the centre, and chains connected it with the rudder astern. 4 ports gave sufficient light to the man at the wheel to see all around him. The cabin was dark, but my eyes soon accustomed themselves to the gloom, and I saw the pilot, his hands resting upon the spokes of the wheel. Outside, the sea appeared vividly illuminated by the lamp which was burning behind us at the other end of the platform. "Now," said Captain Nemo, "let us look for our passage." Electric wires connected the helmsman's cage with the engine room, and the captain could communicate at the same time the necessary speed and direction of his vessel. He pressed a button, and the speed was sensibly diminished. I gazed in silence at the high perpendicular wall alongside which we were running at that moment the unyielding foundation of a sandy coast. We proceeded thus for an hour at a few yards' distance only. Captain Nemo never took his eyes from the compass suspended in the cabin. By a gesture he indicated to the steersman the proper directions. I was placed on the port side and could perceive the magnificent formations of coral. The zoophytes, algae, and crustacea moved their enormous claws which were extended from the holes in the rocks. At 10:15, Captain Nemo himself took the helm. A large black gallery opened before us. The Nautilus entered it boldly. An unusual rushing sound of water accompanied us. This was caused by the waters of the Red Sea which the incline of the tunnel sent rushing into the Mediterranean. The Nautilus was borne upon the torrent like an arrow, notwithstanding that the screw was reversed to counteract the speed. Upon the walls of the tunnel I could distinguish nothing but brilliant rays, lines of fire traced by the speed of our electric light. My heart beat fast, and I put my hand to my chest. At 10:35, Captain Nemo gave up the wheel to the helmsman, and turning to me said, "The Mediterranean." In less than 20 minutes, the Nautilus, carried along by the current, had passed beneath the Isthmus of Suez. 1 second. I have just remembered that for this whole recording, my PC's fans have been on loud, so hopefully it's still a decently acceptable recording. Otherwise I will have to do this live later. Chapter 6. The Grecian Archipelago. At dawn next day, February 12th, the Nautilus came up to the surface again. I ran up the platform. 3 miles to the southward I could see the outline of Pelusium. A torrent had carried us from sea to sea, but the tunnel, though easy to descend, seemed to me impossible to ascend. About 7 a.m. Ned and Conseil joined me. These two inseparables had been calmly sleeping, without troubling themselves about the exploits of the Nautilus. "Well, sir," asked the Canadian in a bantering tone, "and how about this Mediterranean?" "We are floating on its surface, friend Ned." "What?" said Conseil. "Last night—" "Yes, last night, in a few minutes, we cleared the Isthmus of Suez." "I don't believe a word of it," said Ned. "Well, you were wrong, Master Land. That low coast trending to the south is Egypt." "Or some other," replied the infatuated Canadian. but since Monsieur says it is so, says Conseil, you must believe him. Besides, Ned, Captain Nemo showed me the tunnel. I was close to him in the pilot house while he steered the Nautilus through the passage. Do you hear, Ned? Asked Conseil. And since you have such good eyes, Ned, I added, you can perceive the piers of Port Said. The Canadian looked attentively at them. Well, he said, you are right, sir, and this captain is a wonderful fellow. We are in the Mediterranean. Good. We may talk of our own little business if you please, but so that we may not be overheard. I saw very well what the Canadian was driving at. In any case, I thought it better that he should talk, since he wanted to do so, and we all sat down by the lamp, where we were less likely to be subject to the spray. Now, Ned, we are listening, said I. What have you to tell us? It is not much, he replied. We are in Europe, and before Captain Nemo's vagaries plunge us into the polar seas, I vote we quit the Nautilus. This style of conversation always embarrassed me. I did not wish to be any tie upon my friends, and at the same time I did not want to leave Captain Nemo. Thanks to him and his vessel, I was day by day increasing my studies, and I was rewriting my book respecting the submarine depths of those very depths themselves. Should I ever have such another chance to observe the wonders of the ocean? Certainly not, and I could not bear to leave the Nautilus before our round of exploration was completed. Friend Ned, I said, answer me frankly. Are you tired of being on board? Do you regret the fate that placed you in Captain Nemo's hands? The Canadian did not reply immediately. Then, folding his arms, he said, Frankly, then, I do not regret this voyage. I am very glad to have made it, but to have made it, it must have an end. That is my opinion. It will come to an end, Ned. When and where? Where? I cannot say. When, I do not know, but I suppose it will end when we learn nothing more from the sea. Everything must have an end in this world. I agree with Monsieur that when we have been all round the world, Captain Nemo will give us our liberty. We have nothing to fear from the captain, I said, but I do not so far agree with Conseil's ideas. We are master of the secret of the Nautilus, and I cannot expect that the captain will take the risk of releasing us and letting his secrets be known. Then what do you expect? Inquired Ned. That circumstances may occur by which we may and ought to profit as well 6 months hence as now. All very well, but where shall we be in 6 months hence? Here, perhaps, or in China. You know the Nautilus is a rapid sailor. It can cross the seas as a swallow the air, or like an express train on land. It does not fear frequented seas. Who can tell whether we may not close with the coasts of France, England, or America, when an attempt to escape might be made with at least as much hope of success as now? Monsieur Aronnax, said Ned Land, your arguments won't hold water. You speak of the future. We shall be here or there, but I speak of the present. We are here. Let us profit by the opportunity. I was hit hard by Ned's logic and felt beaten. I had no other argument to advance. Sir, replied Ned, let us propose, as an impossibility, that Captain Nemo were to offer you liberty today. Would you accept it? I am not sure, I replied. And were he to say that he would not renew his offer, would you then accept it? I did not answer. And what do you think of it, friend Conseil? Demanded Ned. Friend Conseil, replied that worthy. Friend Conseil has nothing to say on the subject. He is absolutely disinterested. As the master, and as is Ned, he is a single man. No wife, children, nor parents await his return. He is in his master's service. He thinks and speaks as his master does, and, to his great regret, you must not count on him for a casting vote. There are only 2 persons here, my master on one side, Ned Land on the other. So Conseil listens, and will mark the points for you. I could not repress a smile to see how completely Conseil annihilated his personality. The Canadian ought to have been delighted at not having him against him. Then, monsieur, since Conseil does not exist, the discussion is confined to us two. I have spoken. What is your reply? The thing must be settled once for all, and evasion was distasteful to me. Friend Ned, I said, here is my answer. You have had the best of it, and my arguments have not been able to stand against yours. We must not count upon the goodwill of Captain Nemo. The most common prudence would prevent him from releasing us. On the other hand, prudence bids us to take advantage of the first opportunity to quit the Nautilus. You speak wisely, Monsieur Aronnax. But just one observation, said I. The occasion must be a good one, for our first attempt will surely be our last, and, if retaken, Captain Nemo will not forgive us. Quite right, replied the Canadian, but your remark applies to all attempts at flight. In 2 years' time, or 2 days, now the question is this. If a favourable occasion presents itself, we must seize it. Quite so. And now, Ned, what do you consider as a favourable occasion? When, some dark night, the Nautilus is not far from some European coast. And you will endeavour to save yourself by swimming? Yes, if we are not too far from the beach, and if the ship be on the surface. Not if we were far away or under water, of course. And in that case? In that case, I would endeavour to get out the launch. I know how to work it. We should have to get inside it and draw the bolts, when we should come to the surface without even the steersman, who is forward, being aware of our flight. Good, Ned. Look out for the opportunity, and remember that a hitch in the arrangements will be fatal. I will not forget, sir, replied Ned. Now, Ned, would you like to hear my opinion of your project? Gladly, Monsieur Aronnax. Well, I do not say hope. I think that this occasion will never present itself. Why not? Because Captain Nemo cannot hide from himself the idea that we hope to recover our liberty some day, and he will be on his guard, particularly in European waters and in sight of European coasts. I agree with Monsieur, said Conseil. We shall see, replied Ned, nodding his head in a determined manner. And now, Ned Land, said I, let the matter rest thus as it is. Not a word of all this. When you are ready, let us know, and we will follow you. I leave the matter entirely to you. So this conversation, which was destined to lead to grave results, terminated here. I ought to mention that the facts appeared to confirm my predictions, to the Canadian's despair. Did Captain Nemo distrust us while in these crowded seas, or did he only wish to conceal his ship from the numerous vessels that sailed the Mediterranean? I cannot say, but we certainly were more often underneath the water, and at a greater distance from the coast than formerly. When the Nautilus emerged, nothing was visible but the pilot's house, and we went to great depths also, for between the Grecian archipelago and Asia Minor we found more than 1,000 fathoms of water. I only knew we were near the island of Carpathos, one of the Sporades, by Captain Nemo quoting me Virgil's lines as he placed his hand on the map. Est in Carpathia Neptuni gurgit vates. Corellius Proteus. This was the ancient residence of Proteus, the shepherd of Neptune's flocks, now the Isle of Scarpanto, situated between Rhodes and Crete. But I saw nothing in the granitic foundations from the windows of the saloon. Next day, the 14th of February, I made up my mind to devote a few hours to the study of the fish of the archipelago, but for some reason the panels remained closed. Upon taking the course of the Nautilus, I perceived that we were approaching Candia, the ancient Crete. When I had embarked on board the Abraham Lincoln, I had heard that the inhabitants of this island had revolted against the Turks, but how the insurrection had prospered since that time I was absolutely ignorant, and Captain Nemo could not, of course, give me any information on this point. I made no allusion to it when, in the evening, I was alone with him in the saloon. Besides, he seemed to be taciturn and preoccupied. Then, Contrary to his usual custom, he ordered the panels of the saloon to be opened, and he watched the water attentively from one or the other. What his purpose was in so doing I could not divine, and I amused myself by watching the fish. I remarked the gobies mentioned by Aristotle, and vulgarly called sea loaches, which are chiefly found in the salt water about the delta of the Nile. Near these were a semi-phosphorescent bream, a sort of sparus which the Egyptians hold sacred, and the arrival of which in the Nile announces a rich overflow, and is celebrated by religious ceremonies. I also saw some kaolons, a bony fish with transparent scales, which are great devourers of marine plants and most excellent to eat, and were much prized by the epicures of ancient Rome. Another inhabitant of the seas attracted my attention, and renewed all my recollections of antiquity. This was the remora, which travels fixed upon the belly of the shark. According to the ancients, this little fish fastened to the keel of a ship could stop its course, and one of them in this way kept back the galley of Antony at the Battle of Actium, and thus facilitated the victory of Augustus. On how little the destinies of nations hang. I also noticed some beautiful anthiae, which belong to the Lucian order, a fish sacred to the Greeks, who attribute to them the power to chase marine animals from the waters they frequent. Their name means flower, and is justified by their colours, which comprise every shade of red, from the rose to the ruby tint. I was gazing earnestly at these marvels of the sea when an unexpected apparition appeared. A man appeared suddenly, a diver, carrying at his waist a leathern purse. He was not shipwrecked, but a vigorous swimmer, disappearing occasionally to breathe and then returning immediately. I turned to Captain Nemo and exclaimed, "Here is a shipwrecked man. We must save him at all hazards." The captain made no answer, but approached the window. The diver came near, and putting his face against the glass, he looked at us. To my utter astonishment, Captain Nemo made a sign to him. The diver waved his hand, at once ascended, and did not again appear. "Don't alarm yourself," said Captain Nemo. "It is only Nicholas, of Cape Matapan, surnamed Pesca. He is well known in the Cyclades. A daring diver, water is his element. He lives in it more than on land, passing between the islands even as far as Crete." "You know him, Captain?" "Why not, Monsieur Aronnax?" As he said this, he advanced towards a cabinet, placed near the left window of the saloon. Near to this I saw a coffer bound with iron, on the cover of which was a plate of copper, engraved with a representation of the Nautilus and the motto Mobilis in Mobile. The captain opened the chest, which held a quantity of ingots. Golden ingots! Whence could he have collected this enormous sum of money? What was he going to do with it? I did not speak. I looked on. Captain Nemo took these ingots and placed them mathematically one by one in the chest, which he filled completely. I estimated that there must have been 4,000 pounds weight of gold. 5 millions of francs. The chest was securely fastened down, and the captain wrote upon the lid an address in characters which appeared to me to be modern Greek. That done, the captain pressed a button communicating with the men's quarters. 4 men appeared, and without any trouble they pushed the chest out of the saloon. Subsequently, I could hear them hauling it up the iron staircase. Captain Nemo then turned to me and said, "You were saying?" "I was saying nothing," I replied. "Then, sir, you will allow me to bid you good night." And he quitted the saloon. I returned to my room much exercised in my mind. I tried in vain to sleep. I sought some connection between the appearance of the diver and the chest of gold. I soon perceived by the motion of the Nautilus that we were ascending to the surface. Then I heard some noise on the platform. I fancied that they were launching the boat. It struck the side, and all was quiet. 2 hours later, the same noise and movement were repeated. The boat was hoisted up and secured, and the Nautilus plunged once again beneath the waves. So the millions had been forwarded to their destination. But on what part of the continent? Who was Captain Nemo's correspondent? Next day I related all I had seen to Conseil and Ned. My companions were not less astonished than I had been. "But where does he take his millions to?" asked Ned Land. This we could not answer. After breakfast I went into the saloon and sat down to work. Till 5 p.m. I was arranging my notes, when I suddenly felt a great heat, and I was glad to take off my outer garments of byssus. The heat was extraordinary in effect, for we were not in tropic latitudes, and besides, the Nautilus, being under water, would not be affected in any case. I looked at the manometer. We were at a depth of 60 feet, to which the heat of the air could not reach. I continued to work, but the heat became intolerable. "Is the ship on fire?" I thought. I was about to leave the saloon when Captain Nemo entered. He looked at the thermometer and, turning to me, said, 42 degrees. "So I see, Captain, and if the heat increases we shall not be able to bear it. It will not get hotter if we do not like it." "You can reduce it, then, if you wish, Captain?" "No, but I can go farther from the cause of it." "Is it, then, outside the ship?" "Certainly. We are floating in a current of boiling water." "Is it possible?" I exclaimed. "Look." The panels were opened, and I could perceive that the sea was quite white around the Nautilus. A sulphurous vapour rolled amid the waves, which boiled like water in a copper. I placed my hand against one of the windows, but the heat was so great I had to withdraw it. "Where are we?" I asked. "Close to the island of Santorin," replied the captain, "and in the canal which separates Nea Kamenni from Palea Kamenni. I wish to let you see a submarine eruption." "I thought that this formation of new islands had ceased," I said. "Nothing is ever at an end in volcanic localities," replied Captain Nemo, "and the globe is always being moved by these subterranean fires. According to Cassiodorno and Pliny, a new island, Thera, the Divine, appeared in the very place in which these islands have been formed about the 19th year of our era. Then they sank, to rise again in 69, and again disappeared. Since then, to our time, this Plutonian work has been suspended. But on the 3rd of February, 1866, a new island called George Island rose near Nea Kamenni, and disappeared upon the 6th of the same month. 7 days after, the island of Aphroessa appeared, leaving a passage about 12 yards wide between it and Nea Kamenni. I was in these seas when it happened, and was able to observe the phases. The island of Aphroessa, of a rounded form, measured 300 feet across and 30 feet in height. It was composed of a black and vitreous lava, mingled with felspar. Finally, on the 10th of March, a smaller island called Rekka arose close to Nea Kamenni, and since these three islands have been united. "And the canal in which we now are?" I asked. "There it is," replied Captain Nemo, indicating on a map of the archipelago. "You see that I have put down all the newest islands." "But this canal will some day be filled up, surely?" "Very likely, Monsieur Aronnax, for since 1866 8 little islands of lava have risen opposite the harbour of St. Nicholas, in Palea Kamenni. It is therefore evident that Nea and Palea will be joined together some day. If in the Pacific there are infusoria, which form continents, here it is by eruptive phenomena. You can see, sir, what work is being done beneath the waves." I turned to the window. The Nautilus was not going fast. The heat became almost unbearable. The white appearance of the sea had given place to a red tinge, which colour was due to salts of iron. Notwithstanding the hermetic sealing of the saloon, an almost insupportable smell of sulphur was present, and I could perceive that the bright red of the flames completely overcame the electric light. I felt in a bath. I was choking. I was almost broiled. I really did feel as if I were cooking. "We cannot remain in this boiling water any longer," I said. "No," replied the captain calmly. "It would be scarcely prudent." An order was passed along. The Nautilus went about and soon left the furnace at a distance. A quarter of an hour later, we were breathing at the surface of the sea. It occurred to me that if Ned Land had selected those places to make his escape in, we should never emerge alive from the fiery sea. The following day, February 16th, we left the basin between Rhodes and Alexandria, which can boast of a depth of about 4,500 yards, and the Nautilus, giving Cerigo a wide berth, doubled Cape Matapan and left the Greek archipelago astern.